Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello and welcome to The Print. We have with us today Dr. Aparna Pandey. She is the director of the Initiative on the Future of India and South Asia at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. Welcome to The Print, Aparna, and congratulations to you on your book. So we are going to unveil this book, which is called Make India Great, right? So,
yes.
And also there's an interesting subtitle to it, which we call, we have called India this reluctant global power. So we have this beautifully wrapped for you. Here is the book, Making India Great, the promise of a reluctant global power. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So this has been published by HarperCollins with a fantastic cover and very good reviews. So my first question to you, Aparna, will be the thing that you have done is this wonderful book that one can read anywhere while in office, in between work, while as a student, in the metro, in the bus, anywhere. And you have put this entire great India in just 200 pages. How could you do this? That's what I wanted to ask you first, and rest my questions will come in. So please tell us.
Thank you so much, Nanima. It's a pleasure to be with you and with Print. The idea of the book actually came from the fact that as Indians, we grow up. We've grown up, whether it's you or me or our parents or our grandparents, we've always believed in India being great. And we've basically been waiting for the world to acknowledge India's greatness. So what I wanted to look at was that why is it said that 73 years, in 2 days, it's India's Independence Day, 73 years after independence, we are still having the same conversation. What is it that prevents us from becoming great? And what is it that we have not done? So I wanted to make it easy for anybody to read. You didn't have to be an Indian. You didn't need to know much about Indian history or politics or economy. But I wanted people to understand what is it and in which area. So everything from social issues, the idea of India, economic, military, foreign policy, and also grand strategy. And overall, why is it that we are not great? Why is it that we are not a great power? Why is it that we are not on the UN Security Council as a permanent member? Why is it that people keep talking about a rising India, an emerging India, a to-be great power India, sort of an Asian power India, but it's never that, India is great. But as Indians, we believe we are already there. So what is this dichotomy between our promise and our hesitance or our reluctance? So that's what the book is about, and that's why I wrote it.
Interesting. So, Aparna, my question was, let's just start again in the sense, the ethos, the thought process behind writing this book. So, some of us like to believe that we are this great civilization. Nothing about us can be anything lesser than the word great, right? And every time you talk about, you talk about academicians, teachers, journalists, diplomats across the board, there is this thing that India is great, right? And we are as if this flawless society. So we'll come to the flaws, and also the fact that this word reluctant global power is very interesting because, as you said, we dream of being at the high table everywhere, yet we sort of take a step back and we are averse to probably taking risks.
Yes.
So can you just give us a summary of where all do you think this greatness should limit itself, and where is it that we need to now take that quantum leap by taking certain risks?
So I will sort of, I'd break it up into a few segments. I'd start off, if you look at the social issues. Yes, India has a 5,000-year-old civilization. There's a lot that India has achieved on on the social fronts. We managed to educate people. We have a large working class. We have universities which are world renowned. We have scientists. We have engineers. We have doctors the world over. Yet, 73 years after independence, for a 5,000-year-old civilization which is valued women, why is it that there are fewer women in the labor force today than there were in the 1990s? Second, 73 years after independence and after promising that we would eliminate caste-based discriminations, why is it that you and I still read about that? Why is untouchability still prevalent in society? Third, the idea of India, the image of India in the world is that of a large, democratic, plural society. Our freedom struggle basically exemplified that. We are a secular, democratic country according to our constitution and according to what you and I believe. Then why is it that even today, based on whether it is the issue of the cow, whether the issue of the Indian identity, the issue of the place of minorities, we still have lynchings, and minorities do not feel as safe in India as they did maybe a decade or two ago. So there are certain things we can be proud of, but certain things which pull us back. Look at economy. I mean, we can talk about having a large middle class. There's a lot we have achieved. We no longer have famines. We have food to provide our people. We have businesses and corporations which have gone the world over, from Tata's to Mahindra to Reliance. Yet, why is it that if we can send satellites into space, we still do not have a branded razor or a branded fountain pen, which is known the world over? Why is it that 3 decades after our liberalization, we have still not moved forward on land law reform, labor market reforms, the second generation of reform, fiscal market and capital market reforms? Why is it that if we want to actually provide jobs to around 500 million Indians who are in the labor force, only 5% of our workforce is skilled? For industrialized countries, it is 60%. Why is that? We have universities which are well known, but primary and secondary school, we have not focused on. Why is that? If we turn to military, we have a large military. We rank 4th on the global firepower index. We have nuclear weapons. Yet, we spend less on the defense budget as a percentage of GDP, and a large part of that percentage of GDP actually goes into pensions and into salaries. 2 years ago, the then Vice Chief of Army Staff had said that 68% of India's equipment is out of date. How can we be a great power military? How can we fight against China and against Pakistan if need be, and be a great power and help in the Indo-Pacific and beyond, if we don't have a great power military? Secondly, the second part of that is defense acquisition. We need to plan that if in 20 years we will be the paramount power, or we want to be the paramount power in Asia, we should have everything we need for it. If we don't plan, we will still be where we are 20 years from now, and you and I will be having the same conversation. Finally, foreign policy-wise, yes, we have good relations with a number of countries, but why is it that despite knowing what the problems are 7 decades after independence, we still have challenges with our immediate neighborhood? We may count 1 or 2 countries on our fingers of our immediate neighbors with whom we do not have tensions. We do not have conflicts. At a time when China is sitting on our border, why are our relations with Nepal and Sri Lanka, and to some extent even Bangladesh, not as good as they were a few years ago? So if you can't have South Asia rooting for you as a big power, how are you going to convince countries which are not your neighbors? And finally, India's image and India's ability to project its image will be dependent on how the world looks at India. India has been perceived as a status quo power, which is comfortable with its borders, which has built its economy, educated its people, and been democratic and plural. It is not viewed as expansionist, hegemonic, or aggressive. But the more we change society or try to change society within, our image abroad will also be affected. And that will hurt or impede our ability to be a great power. I'll stop there.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a fantastic explanation, and also I know. I mean, the book will be released later in the month, and I'm the lucky one to be able to read the book. So, what I loved about the book is how you sort of being able to juxtapose some of the policy measures, right? So, on one hand, you're saying that India has this target of increasing leather revenues by 2020 or 2022. We never meet the targets, by the way.
No.
Yeah, you have this thing on cow vigilantism, and you've seen how it has, turned into some kind of, mob lynching and other things. All those incidents are quite, there in our memories. And also, you talk about how India has this dream of being in the Quad, being in this powerful grouping, yet you have people, doing vandalism and ransacking of, places when it comes to a Bollywood movie like Padmavat, So I really like the way you've juxtaposition, and these are the thoughts that really come in an ordinary Indian's mind, that what is it that we really want to do? Either you want to be this great power, as you said, who has these dreams, and on the other hand, these are some of the things that really makes you look like you're in the dark ages. So how do you think, as the government, be it the Modi government or maybe in the future, 10 years down the line, maybe 20 years down the line, whichever government comes in, what is it that you think the way they can balance it out? Because after all, we are this, world's oldest democracy, and we have various kind of people having this very strong religious sentiments.
So what I would say is, at some stage, we have to find the sort of, via media, between having a philosophical argument and a debate. Nenuma and I can talk for maybe 1 week about whether or not partition should have occurred. I'll give you an example. But it's occurred, it's a reality, 73 years ago. India and Pakistan and Bangladesh are 3 independent countries. So can we have a philosophical debate of whether or not it should have happened? Philosophically speaking, yes. What could have gone? We can do all the what ifs. What if it was not the British? What if the French had won in the 1900s? We would all be speaking French today, maybe. But that should not prevent us from taking a policy decision. So have a philosophical debate, whether it's in the classrooms, in the media, in the parliament. Have a philosophical debate, but do not let the philosophical debate or sort of your concerns about what happened in the past impede a policy decision or exert economic or political costs. So yes, I mean, for people, for a large number of Hindus, the cow is a sacred animal. Yes, fine. But that should not mean that just because somebody eats or kills a cow, just because a person has written a book, somebody has painted a painting or produced a film, how can a 5,000-year-old culture, how can it be hurt by one individual or one producer or one person doing something like this? It should not be hurt. It is too old, it has lasted for too long, and it will survive everything which has been thrown at it. So have a philosophical discussion, but do not let it impede your political and your economic consequences. I mean, the cow issue as well. I mean, sort of, person does not want to eat it, does not want to eat it. Person does not want to kill it, does not. But don't go about lynching and killing people. And the way, I mean, I would like, or I hope the future governments can look at it is, it should be, it's dependent on the individual. So society can be conservative, a society can be religious, an individual can be pious. But the state,
right?
Yeah, but the state should be secular. The state's fundamental should be secular. So provide law and order, protect individuals, send the message that you don't want religious vigilantism on the streets. But If somebody does not want to eat or does not want to kill, that is an individual decision. But do not accept religious vigilantism and make sure that there's law and order. Finally, the economic part. What is the use of owning an asset like a cow or a sort of, a sheep or goat if I cannot at the end of the day sell it off for something? I mean, there has to be a terminal value of the asset I own, even a laptop. I should be able to sell it, even if for a few $100s.
Absolutely. Also, Aparna, another aspect that you spoke about in your previous answer is about this South Asia routing for you. And presently, we can see the kind of problems that India is facing because of the fact that, which I believe, it is my personal opinion, is that if you're this big power within a region, a small region, and you have these neighbors who are much smaller than you, but then they have their own identity, how long can you not talk? I mean, yes, if it's a difficult neighbor like Pakistan, yes, if it is Nepal, which is, in a way has asserted their independence by releasing a new map, you may be upset about it, but you need to talk, right? And that goes for anything in life, that if you have issues, you need to talk. So how do you think this government is probably, I'm sure they have these brilliant diplomats and we've seen how our foreign policy works, but how do you think, and then this standoff also with China, which is another issue, but within the immediate neighborhood, what do you think needs to be done? I think dialogue is most important and you cannot shy away from that.
No, you can't. And I agree with you totally. I've always believed that there have been sins of omission and commission that India has made. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we've done things maybe we shouldn't, and sometimes we've not done things when we should have. So yes, our relations with our neighbors are complicated, but sort of, every country's relations are complicated. Ours come from the fact that we are much larger than all of them. If we leave Pakistan aside, then, whether it's Sri Lanka or Maldives or even Nepal, it's sort of, the disparity in size and population is immense. The second part of it is we share borders, we share ethnic linguistic borders. So sort of, the Madhesi issue in Nepal, the issue about Bengalis in, on both sides of the border in Bangladesh, the Tamil issue with Sri Lanka. Pakistan, Pakistan is complicated also, as you know, for various reasons, because of partition, because of Pakistan's own foreign policy and domestic politics, its military. So even if we leave Pakistan aside, but at the end of the day, India's foreign policy also has had a problem, which is that we believe that our neighbors are our first layer of security. We want them to keep our interests in mind. Now, managing what you can call a sphere of influence or a neighborhood is not just, my telling Nayanima what she needs to do, but my actually asking Nayanima, what can I do for her? And when she asks for something, I should be able to deliver on time. If I am not able to provide the developmental assistance, the economic assistance, the security assistance that she needs, if I don't understand that all politics is local at some level and allow some of the politics to play out in the neighboring country, then at some stage is going to reach a head. So it's not as though we don't know what's happening in Nepal. It's been happening for some time. It's not as though Nepal hasn't claimed the areas it has claimed. The difference is they've now issued a map, because I guess everybody is in the policy. Pakistan has issued a new map. Nepal is issuing a map. China always issues maps every few years. So sort of, it is not something new. But I do believe that, the Indian Foreign Service does know what to do. You've been tackling these countries for 73 years. How can you not know what the issues are? The problem comes that when you India has always found it easier to deal with its neighbors when we appear less aggressive and we appear more, let's say, Indian civilizational and less, Hindu nationalist. Mm-hmm. When you start using domestic politics and identity in your foreign policy as well, when you sort of become a little more aggressive, then neighbors will always fear you more than they did at another stage. So when India is sort of, the India which is primarily focused on economic policy, military, foreign policy, everything is fine. When you start pushing civilizational links, the smaller country will always push back because it fears. Remember, at the end of the day, India's neighbors do not fear India's military potential, because we don't that's not what they fear, being civilizationally subsumed in a greater Indian civilization.
True.
So talking about, it's the Indian subcontinent, not South Asian. So, sort of Pakistan's fear remains that, Sri Lanka's remains that, Bangladesh has by and large not suffered from that, primarily with a very strong Bengali identity. So it has and so, again, Bhutan doesn't fear that. But the other three do fear that. So the more you push, a civilizational identity which allows each country to have its own, it's easier. The more you push a civilizational identity which seeks to subsume the other, there will be a pushback in a day and age of nationalism, populism, and sometimes just to be able to stand up to the big brother.
Absolutely. Another thing, Aparna, that really I found it intriguing, although I have read it, it's not that I haven't, but then the way you've dealt it in your book is the first page on geopolitics, where you talk about Indian exceptionalism, right? And that is something you think works against us, because I have seen people basking in the glory that, we are this exceptional power, and as if whatever we strive for, we will get it without even struggling for it, or as I said in the beginning, taking the risk, and which you have so nicely dealt with, again, within those fantastic 200 pages. How do you think this exceptionalism, is this going to hamper us in the long run? When we talk about isolating our neighbors, yes, they are difficult neighbors, diplomatic isolation, and all these words that you keep hearing these days, are they kind of working against us, or do you think maybe that is the way India can probably build its strategic autonomy on? What is it, you think?
So I would say, there's an advantage to things as long as they remain a tactic or an underlying principle. When you make it a strategy, there's a problem, right? So the example I would give is, non-alignment. Non-alignment was great as a tactic. It wasn't necessarily that useful if you sort of made a strategy for 4 or 5 decades. It was a different world. So coming to exceptionalism, part of it is civilizational, right? We do believe we are unique. We are an example. Our foreign policy, our identity exemplifies that. Why do we need to be on the UN Security Council? Because we are India. Because we are one of two civilizations, which is 5,000 years old, which is more than 1 billion people. Because we are strategically located. Because we are a democracy. So we are entitled to be on it. To some extent, countries understand that, okay, you are a large country, you are well located, you are doing well economically, fine, maybe you should be on it. But where we face challenges is, at the end of the day, where do we want to go? What is it that we are seeking? Are we seeking to be on the UN Security Council just because 5 other countries are on it and we are entitled, or because we actually deserve to be on it? For that, we would have to make efforts. First, challenges where this exceptionalism sort of creates problems for us. Look at WTO. We are part of the World Trade Organization, but we are seen as the obstacle. We are seen as the country which keeps demanding, something unique for India, something exceptional for India. Look at the nuclear program. Yes, we got an exception from the IAEA. The US gave us a sort of an India-specific nuclear deal 15 years ago. But sort of, instead of actually becoming part of the world, everywhere we go, we seek an exception for us. We want to be made part of it, not because we are a great power. So let me reframe it. The countries which are great powers because one, they have the economic potential, two, they have the military potential, three, their peers recognize them as such. We believe that the third one, we are recognized by the world, so the first two shouldn't matter. Actually, none of the three apply to us as of now. Even our neighborhood doesn't recognize us as a great power. Countries want us to be great powers. The US would like us to be. We are lucky. There is sort of, almost no time in history when countries would want a peer competitor, when countries would want another power to be a great power. Our fundamental challenge is we actually believe in the rah-rah we are hearing and believe that because the world wants us to be a great power, therefore it will help us to become one, even without us implementing policies that will enable that. And two, that even if we don't do anything, we will by default become a great power. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, where the exceptionalism, the civilizational heritage sort of, it prevents us from looking within and seeing why. I mean, what is it that keeps holding us back? What is it? Is it our belief that we are going to become one, which prevents us from actually undertaking, that painstaking, painful, policies, and understanding that every decision we take has a consequence. Mm-hmm. Even if it is a social decision, even if it's an educational one. And I'll throw one last point out. You and I are speaking in English. I have grown up speaking English. I'm sure you have as well. For me, English is like Hindi or Sanskrit or any of the other languages I speak. I don't see it as different. I don't see it as foreign. And I believe not just because I like speaking English, but because I believe India has a strategic and economic advantage in the world, the fact that a large number of Indians speak English. Just because sort of it feels good sort of to say that you are standing up and you're not speaking English or you're not going to teach English will have a consequence 10 to 15 years later when there will not be that many people who will speak English in India. And that will lose India a strategic advantage and economic advantage. Companies right now don't worry about coming to India. They will find an English-speaking person. They don't have to bring in or train people. So don't sort of, we will lose our advantages that we have had for the last 7 decades unless we think through the consequences of each and every action we take. I'll stop there.
Mm-hmm. So, Aparna, let me ask you a few things, okay? Since 2019 till now, the government has claimed that it has taken some historic decisions just to put an end to the legacy that it had. One is the abrogation of Article 370, 35A, and the verdict on the Ayodhya dispute. And you just saw how Prime Minister Modi attended the Bhumi Pujan at the Ram Mandir, where the Mandir will be built. So, I mean, in the words of the government, these are being done to sort of close the chapter there in history and move on. Do you see that moving on sort of happening after this? Because we hear these reports coming from Kashmir that things are not normal. Other side says, yes, it is all normal. They are, coming back to track. But there are also, evidences that they're not really sort of in the normalcy. And also this thing about secularism, this debate that is going on in India right now on this Ram Mandir secularism and what on from here. So my question to you would be, we are all in this very confused state. Probably, yes, the government has this straight road that it can see. Do you think that these chapters are really closed and we are now moving on to become the great power that we want to be, because we are now very enthusiastic about Indo-Pacific Quad? We walked out of RCEP, but we are looking at having a small, big trade deal with the US. We are also having, looking at another trade deal. I'll come to the economics part later because that's a fantastic way you've dealt with some of the issues there. And I'll also come to the WTO part because that's something I really follow. But this moving on, do you think we are on that track to now move on, and while we have, settled all other previous issues?
No, I don't think so. Short answer is no. The long answer, I'll break into three parts. I look at Kashmir separately from Ayodhya. And the reason is that I believe that part of the problem is the struggle between, who are we as an Indian? The idea of India, the social issue. At the end of the day, is being Indian what was originally enshrined in our constitution? And one of the two strands I talk about, which is, the idea of India being a civilizational tent, where it doesn't matter what religion you are, where your forefathers came from, what religion you adopted, you would still be an Indian. Or is it that there were a number of historical, the number of historical rights which need to be wrongs which need to be righted? For about 1,000 years, there have been things which have happened and they have maligned Indian civilization or Hindu civilization. And so therefore they need to be righted, even if it is done 1,000 years later. And it's because of the need to do so. And Indian identity, Indian secularism as we have known it is more pseudo, and it's not real secularism, because the Hindu majority does not feel that India is it. So I think both Kashmir and article and Ayodhya come within this broader thing, but there are certain differences. So if you come to Kashmir first, I would say I'm one of those who believes Kashmir has always had three dimensions. One is the India-Pakistan, the broader India-Pakistan dimension, which includes many other issues, including the desire for parity by Pakistan, the refugee crisis from before partition, but there's that element to it. The second part is that of terrorism. We can say there is a part of it which is homegrown, but there's a large part of it which is sponsored by Pakistan. And I don't believe that, the first part of the India-Pakistan dispute has been resolved. No, we are far from that. The second part of the terrorism issue, as long as we clamp down on security, we may be able to push it ahead, but it's still going to remain. Pakistan's military has not given up on using jihad as a lever of its foreign policy. So that's not going to change. So India is going to remain. And thirdly, at the end of the day, India needs to convince its citizens in Kashmir, in Jammu, in Ladakh, that they are Indians as much as somebody living in Delhi or somebody living in Cochin. Until you are able to convince them that they are Indian and that you will give them their due political, social, economic rights, making legislative changes will have only a limited impact. So I would say the decision taken last August is still a few years away. And there's a lot more that Delhi needs to do to convince the Kashmiris, because that's what you have to do at the end of the day. You have to convince the people on the ground that they need to give you time and that they need to believe that they are part of India. This Ayodhya dispute, as I said, it's primarily part of this desire to right a wrong. I don't believe that, righting a wrong 1,000 years later or 5,000 years later is the right way to go. I wouldn't necessarily say that we should quote Mahatma Gandhi and say, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. But at the end of the day, what happened, there's a lot that happened in the past. If we start rectifying all of that, then we'll have multiple challenges. Then there will be incidents where you will have the lower castes who will say that, for 5,000 years or 4,000 years, we faced untouchability. What are you going to do to right our wrongs? We can always find wrongs in the past. The way to move forward is to actually say that, yes, something happened, but maybe let's find a way to move forward which will not create another problem 20 years from now or 40 years from now from people who feel that today there was a wrong which they need to right. This is not how, a country which is an old civilization, which is a diverse civilization and which wants to be a future great power this is not how you deal with challenges. You are supposed to take a deep breath and move forward. You're not supposed to right every perceived wrong from the past. And finally, you mentioned that, India is part of Quad. India is key to Indo-Pacific. There's a lot that India wants to do, including large trade deal. And I would say, there's a challenge. How can you become sort of truly be a member of the Quad and participate fully in Indo-Pacific if you are going to grow at, let's say, -4% this year, or 5% according to IMF, when you haven't undertaken any of the economic reforms which will jumpstart your economy, when instead of actually opening your borders, you are planning to close and become more self-sufficient, when you are spending less on military today, and when China is sitting on your border, you had to actually go to Russia to get supply parts ensured, and you are basically buying off the shelf. That is not how a great power behaves. A great power has everything already with it, so it can face multiple challenges. A great power plans. A great power does not write or care about writing perceived historical incidents. You are moving forward. You are not obsessing about the past. I mean, something in the book which sort of, when I was writing that sentence, it sort of, I keep thinking back about it. It is that, Indians sort of, periodically we will sort of, when we are moving forward, it's as though we stop and we think and we start worrying about wrongs and we'll move backward rather than moving forward. Why is it? Why is it that we, every few years, when we are doing well economically or on most fronts, we believe that we need to go back to the past? We need to debate something which happened, the Padmavat incident, something in the 14th century, recorded in the 16th century. The film was made in 2018. It shut down the IT capital at that time of this country.
So, Aparna, just one thing. Do you think somewhere down the line, governments, and not just this government, even the previous UPA regime, we've seen the kind of protests they had seen at that point of time on FDI and multi-brand retail, which, led this government promise forever that we'll not allow that. When everything was going fine and, at one point of time, Walmart had to quit India. Do you think the messaging is wrong somewhere down the line from the government to its citizenry? Or maybe, we are not able to manage this diverse population and need to give that kind of, dreams to them that, these are not the things you should be worrying about. So how do you see that kind of a dichotomy? Because I'm not saying nobody has the good intention to take India forward, but where do you bring that balance where, and in today's social media world, one policy comes up and there's this tweet that goes viral or something. How do you manage? Do you think that messaging has to be worked upon?
I would say yes, but it's also sort of, one of our Nobel Prize winners, Amartya Sen, wrote a book titled The Argumentative Indian. Yeah. And at some level, it applies to all of us. We love to debate and discuss. We can pick any one issue and we can go on and discussing about it. But the difference between, writing a book and debating an issue, whether it is on the media or sort of, in a classroom, and sort of actually allowing that debate to play out in public on the streets. So I think sort of part of it is that we are unable to, as I said, we are unable to restrict the debates to where they should be. So there should be a full-fledged debate in Parliament on, whether or not there should be FDI. Have a debate, bring in people, ask everybody to sort of, say what they are in favor of, what they are against. Have it on television. But instead of that, what we will have protests and demonstrations on the streets by the unions for or against. We will shut down roads, and that will then basically ensure that the government does nothing. So I think there is a problem there that we don't know where to debate. The debate isn't meant for student unions or for labor unions to protest on the streets. The debate should be held where it is meant to be held, which is in the Parliament, which is in the media. Similarly, it's things like, economic issues. I mean, there's a presumption that the Indian people do not understand what is good for them on the economic front. That if you have reforms, sort of people will not sort of actually bring you back to power. And my argument is, why not? Why don't you explain to them? You have a bull, as the Americans call a bully pulpit. You have Twitter, you have Parliament, you have television, you have social media. Explain to people that, if you want to be able to stand up to China, if you want to be a great power, we will need to implement these economic reforms. We will need to spend money on, infrastructure. And therefore, we will need to do this. The easier way out is to have a demonstration on the street or to have a limited discussion in Parliament and then shelve an issue, rather than actually sort of saying, just as you tell your child that you cannot have ice cream every day, or, you cannot watch a movie every day, they need to study, and then only in vacation time should they be doing this. You can tell, anyway, the sort of, Indian government has a paternalistic attitude. We know what is good for you. So if you're telling people, tell them that, it's to be a great power, you need to do more. So I think it's a cultural civilizational issue which we have not really learned to deal with. And if we want to actually resolve some of these issues, we will need to have a discussion in the fora which is meant for that discussion, whether it's economic, whether it is social, whether it is military, whether it is foreign policy. The fora has to be the legislature, the fora has to be the Parliament, the fora should be the standing and the consultative committees, the fora should be opinion pieces and editorials in newspapers.
Absolutely. So now, really coming to the economic condition of the country, and I love the way you put it. In order to become this economic superpower, what we do, we don't really go for the suitcase this time in budget, but we go for a Bahi Khata, or we promote this, International Yoga Day, and these sort of gives us this feeling in the mind of an ordinary citizen. Okay, yes, now we've become this superpower, which is asserting their culture and all that. But those are really not the way to become a superpower, according to you. How do you think, again, and then coming back to what India has been facing, so in FDI, there has been this huge resistance. We see this humongous resistance even to free trade. We have this, civil bodies also that talk about not to go for free trade agreements. Whereas we are now in a post-COVID world, we talk about global value chains. We talk about being this alternate to, China when companies are sort of wrapping up there, or maybe looking at a market number 2 apart from China. How do you think we'll be able to do that if we do not really believe in doing a free trade? Because we don't really give that much of energy to negotiating a very tough trade deal. And some of the examples of the India-EU FTA and the India-US FTA that has been in the discourse only now, but India-EU FTA has been going on for last 14 years. In WTO, we do this grandstanding on food subsidies, public stock holding. Yet at the same time, we choose to, and we also say that we love to be this least developing country there, so that we can enjoy the subsidies in that format. Yet we, on the other hand, we say we are this global superpower. And then coming back to the GDP part, if your GDP is not really that impressive, no one really looks at you, and that's the reality. So what do you think needs to be done now, especially in a post-COVID world where competition is only going to be cutthroat no matter what you do? So you have to open up your trade, you have to be more liberal on foreign direct investments, and now you have this anti-China movement going on. Where will all this sort of end up if India really wants to be that power in the next 5 or 10 years, maybe?
So the short answer, Nilima, would be that we would need to sort of undo a number of our previous policies. We would need to actually, yes, domestic manufacturing is good, and every great power does need to have a domestic economic base and defense base. I agree. But if in 7 decades you have not been able to build it right now, maybe the reason is that you need to look why you haven't. Great powers have large manufacturing. You cannot build a large manufacturing base if you prioritize MSMEs. You can't you cannot sort of put manufacturing in the hands of small scale. It has to be economies of scale, which is large scale enterprises. India's focus is primarily being manufacturing sector, keep companies small, minor, micro, give them, sort of subsidies. China has gone the opposite way, whether it's China, it's Bangladesh, it's Vietnam. So if India wants to take advantage of the global supply chains, if India wants companies which are moving out of China, whether they are Japanese, Taiwanese, Korean, or American companies, India will need to do what China has done or Vietnam has done, is actually open its manufacturing sector to large scale manufacturing, which includes giving, some tax incentives, includes more than just the executive orders on labor reforms, sort of changing the land bill, the land acquisition bill, and also opening up opening up rather than restricting trade. But I would go one step further. One of the challenges we face in the economic sector is cultural. There is at the end of the day, there's a cultural aversion to people making money. There's this belief that, you're making money, it's not a good thing. You're being a professor or a teacher or an engineer or a doctor is valued more than you're setting up a business. There's always been a disdain. Added to that, we had an Indian national movement, and we had 200 years of colonial rule, which left the legacy that, foreigners come in and foreign companies come in, and after that they take over the market. So therefore, any multinational corporation, any foreign company entering India's market is viewed suspiciously. That the reason you want, it's all East India Company. So Walmart, Carrefour, it doesn't matter which company you are, which country you belong to. Your aim is to wipe out domestic manufacturing. That is not true today. Companies come in because they're looking for cheap labor. They are looking for, a country which gives them profits. So they are not looking to take over. We are no longer in the 18th and 19th centuries. So that's the second. So there is that legacy. And the third is therefore the paternalistic state. That the state decides what is good for you. Should you study this or should you study that? Should you eat this or eat that? And finally, should this company invest in this or not? Should the company invest in steel? Should they should they focus on IT? So unless you actually pull back the regulations, unless you let the entrepreneurial spirit of Indians actually thrive, unless you allow companies to come in, how are you going to become that economic power which will feed your people, remove poverty? And if you're looking at post-COVID, I'm sure you saw that the World Bank has said that the poverty levels are going to rise across the world. So a number of the benefits we had made in the last 3 decades, we are going to lose some of them in India. The migrant laborers walking across the country, those images also mean that they are not just fewer laborers, but the fact that there's going to be a rise in poverty, there's going to be a rise in inequality. We are going to as it is, have challenges on multiple fronts. This is going to be an added challenge we have. If we don't grow at 6 to 8 to 10%, how are we going to ensure poverty alleviation? How are we going to improve on the inequality? Forget about being able to be a great power. How are we actually even go back to being what we were a few years ago? if we don't grow economically. And for that, there's a lot that needs to be done, including letting go. It's like sort of there's this thing that, parents at some stage have to let go of the child and let the child do what they want. Let the Indian economy go. It will do very well. There are enough there's enough spirit, animal spirit in the economy to do well, if only the chains are unshackled. But I don't know if that will be done. If it's done, then yes. Otherwise, we will continue in this muddled phase of, few steps forward, few steps back. You talked about not joining RCEP, but I believe the government would like to restrict any Chinese origin products coming to the country. Now, that is going to create a problem with our trade with Southeast Asian and East Asian countries, because most of the products manufactured anywhere in the world have an origin in China. You cannot overnight change that. You will need to find a way of doing it over a period of time. Otherwise, you will actually restrict trade. You may reduce the imports, but you'll also reduce the exports. Your trade with the world will actually come down instead of going up at a time when you need to trade more with the world, not less with the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Aparna. That has been a fantastic discussion with you. Once again, this is Aparna Pandey's book, Making India Great, The Promise of Reluctant Global Power. And this is in the print soft cover. We just did the launch. And Aparna, thank you very much. And I am also going to congratulate you for being able to write this book in such a concise manner. And we are not going to struggle by reading it. I really finished it in just 2 days. And, and still I have so much to ask you for. But whatever questions that you might be having, please pick up the book. This is not going to cost you much. This is like, you are having a day out or having a pizza. But this will be really a value addition to your bookshelf. Thank you so much, Aparna. Thank you for talking to the print.
Thank you, Nilima. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much. And thank you to print.